This is something that we do at the Advanced Study Institute of Asia. It's called SenseMaker, where we try and make sense of a larger idea. It could be from a book, it could be from something that's happening around the world, it could just be something that somebody is trying to put out together. So when I came across your book, and I bought the hard copy, as you can see,
Awesome,
Traders,
thank you.
Speculators, and Captains of Industry, I really wanted to read the book because there's something that I'm working on which closely aligns to the history of India. But I was surprised with your introduction and your first chapter because you don't start um, with the obvious. You do not start with 1947.
Yeah.
You go way back. I'm struggling to write a book that is from 1947 to 2026.
Mhm.
How hard was it to start in 1830s? And of course, it is hard, but why?
Yes, that's a super question. So I'll just say that when I began this project a really long time ago, I thought I was going to begin around 1980. So I really thought that,
So just a way back then.
yeah, exactly. So, I really thought about it as the project initially as a liberalization story. And for me, actually, going before 1991, which is, of course, the date that, is often used as the marker of the beginning of economic liberalization in India, going back to around 1980, so really with Indira Gandhi's return to power, I thought was like the big move, the big, to say, look, I'm going to decenter 1991 a little bit and really think about, efforts to liberalize that preceded the sort of 1991 moment. But as you rightly say, I went further back and back. And there are, I guess, a couple of reasons. I mean, first, it really was driven by what I was learning in the field. So I did a lot of field work in India. I'm doing a lot of interviews, observations, and the things that my interlocutors were saying to me really signaled that their understanding of foreign direct investment policy, of the role of multinational firms, and crucially of Indian companies in the economy and in the sort of broader process of industrial development, industrial transformation, which was happening apace during the time when I was in the field, which was around the late 2000s and through the 20 teens, really signaled the importance of really understanding the colonial history as a means of making sense of how contemporary actors, both in the policy domain and business, in the business media, etc., and just in society more broadly, understood foreign firms. Now, in many ways, that of course makes a lot of sense, right? Because as a post-colonial state, the impact and importance of colonialism is of course crucial. In India specifically, the role of the East India Company as a particular agent of British imperialism um, in South Asia is, of course, central. And the East India Company, for example, kept coming up in conversations that I was having, in the 20 teens. It was really remarkable to me in many respects. And so, for that reason, I found that I really needed to go further and further back. And the historical turn happened incrementally. So, first, it was going back to 1947 to really think about the Nehruvian period, as well as the transitions in the 1970s. But then I went further, had to go further back than that because there were kind of key questions, as I mentioned, both about the East India Company, but then also about the emergence of the kind of Indian business groups that we understand and see today. Where did they come from? Many of those firms, as we know, have roots in at least the late 19th century and sometimes a little bit before. So that pushed me further and further back. And then finally, I got to 1830, and that's where I really said I have to stop. But the reason I began in 1830 is because this was a moment of the sort of initial decline of the East India Company. So, of course, the big transition moment happened a little bit later in 1857. Um, but, the initial signs were there from at least the 1830s on one hand. But the other crucial development was the early emergence of what would become the managing agencies, which in many respects took over many of the kind of trading and financial activities that the company was doing as a foreign actor. So that's why I went back to 1830.
Right. And you make it, I mean, it's remarkable because you do it in 257 pages. It's very tightly edited. So, congratulations on the book.
Thanks.
And it, it appears the amount of work that you put into it. So, what we're going to do is we're going to divide it in different phases.
Sure.
Um, I would like to begin with the puzzle that animates the book. And it is that I think you refer to The Economist, and The Economist famous description of the Indian relationship with economic liberalization
Yep.
as a mystery, as a puzzle that oscillates between opening up and pulling back.
Yes.
Uh, there are some standard framework that the Economist newspaper uses in describing it. Corrupt politicians, vote buying, not a level playing field. But you make it very clear in your introduction, which gets into the book, and then also at later stages in the book, that that framing is not adequate. It's it does not really look at the larger picture. So I would like to put you on the spot and ask you, what is it that The Economist and other pink papers seem to be missing? And you, as a historian, as a political scientist, are able to add to it.
Sure. So as you rightly mentioned, so that economist piece was very useful as a framing device, as it turned out, because it really encapsulated, as you note, a number of kind of familiar explanations for what is often referred to as the stop-start nature of India's economic reforms. And I will say that again, just to kind of signal the historical turn, it was very striking to me when I was doing field work how much sort of angst and frustration there was about in India. So even leaving aside sort of the view from global observers like the Economist and so forth, even though of course many of the writers are India based anonymously, but even within India, the level of sort of angst that there was about India not being able to proceed apace with economic reforms. And the references at the time and still today was China, which was seen as having the capacity to pursue reforms consistently and to enable transformation, but also other developing countries as well. And so the explanations that the economist sort of captures are the familiar ones, right? So, corruption, vote buying, it's just a shift back and forth between different political parties, the kind of push and pull of everyday politics, and so on. And, as we know, those, of course, are important explanations for many of the dynamics in the Indian political economy, as in political economies elsewhere. So it's not to say that those weren't important. But what I was finding, again, in my field work was that many of my interlocutors were pointing to what I thought were kind of deeper explanations, ways in which they made sense of business firms, both foreign and domestic, that signaled that there was something going on that went beyond the kinds of explanations uh, of policy reversals that are otherwise familiar to us.
That is very interesting because the other thing that you introduce very early on in the book, in your introduction, is the modal framework. If I can kind of look at it, it's the alternative framework that you use. You use Durkheim's framework of legitimacy. It's very, very interesting to do it, primarily because before we get into the long history,
Yes.
we have to draw the decision to draw on Durkheim
Hmm.
because it's a ethical decision rooted in a philosophical tradition.
Yep.
So for a country like India, and you also then intersperse the example with Indonesia. You also talk about a little bit about the Brazilian model. You
Hmm.
have just spoken about the Chinese model. Why does this distinction matter for this particular argument? I mean, why a philosophical argument?
Yeah, sure. So what I found, and I cite, I think in the introduction, but then also in a couple places later in the book, some examples of the things that people were saying to me in India. Um, And one of the most striking and generative, ultimately, um, was a distinction that was made in an interview with a senior policymaker, where he said, "Look, you have as sort of a slight background to get into a little bit of the details." I became very interested, partly because I was very active at the time, very interested in the politics of joint ventures. Um, so joint ventures, I mean, as we know, were crucial mechanisms that were designed to facilitate technology transfer from multinational firms to their Indian counterparts. So going back to 1991 and even in the 1980s, with some of the earlier reforms in, like commercial vehicles and two-wheelers and so forth, they all were done through tie-ups, right? So in the 80s, the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, FERA, was still in place, which capped foreign participation at 40%. And so many of the tie-ups that we saw in the 80s, so, Bajaj Kawasaki, TVS Suzuki, Hero Honda, DCM Toyota in like commercial vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. And we're all through these tie-ups where the multinational and local partners tended to have about 26% each, and then the rest was sort of in the market. But then even in 1991, with the acceleration of liberalization, again, in most industries, FDI was capped at either 49, 50, or 51%. 51% was the upper limit in the initial 1991 reforms. And then gradually over the 1990s, the caps were raised in different industries. There also were industry-specific, these FDI caps. And so again, what this meant was that foreign direct investment liberalization happened through the joint venture mechanism. And this was very intentional on the part of the Indian government. And interestingly, it's within these joint ventures that much of the sort of backlash in many ways to liberalization emerged. So this was really interesting because you get the sort of dynamics of the politics of liberalization happening at a macro level, but also happening at the kind of organizational level between firms, which makes it just kind of more interesting and generative. And so one policy measure that was put in place to address some complaints that emerged from Indian companies, people, of a certain age might recall, companies that were referred to at the time as the Bombay Club. So this is a group in 1996, seen to be led by Rahul Bajaj, but of course involving many others, that articulated a set of, I think, quite legitimate complaints about FDI liberalization and sort of multinational behavior. Tarun Das, then head of the CII, was also an important sort of source of articulating this view. It had to do with differences in access to finance, the extent to which multinational firms are bringing old technologies rather than new technologies, the extent to which, as the FDI caps were raised, multinationals engaged in actions that were seen as unethical to sort of squeeze out their local partner. By accelerating investment schedules and so forth. So lots of details we can talk about if there's interest. But the response was a policy measure known as Press Note 18 in 1998, which basically required foreign companies to get a non-objection certificate from their Indian counterparts in order to exit joint ventures. And it was meant to sort of rebalance sort of the playing field, a term that was very prominent in a lot of policy and business discourse at the time, and which you mentioned earlier in our conversation. So the idea really was to try to understand what was happening here. And the policymaker that I interviewed, because first there was Press Note 18, and then it was later reversed with Press Note 1 in 2005, said, look, there's a difference between Indian companies. So he focused not on the foreign firms, which is where most of the attention tends to get placed, both in scholarship on foreign investment policy, but even in a lot of the discourse in policy circles and in the press in places like India and elsewhere. Most of it tends to be about the multinationals. But actually, he's like, look, there's a difference between, this is what my interlocutor said, there's a distinction between our Indian companies, where some companies are really interested in learning, getting new technologies, growing the firm, sort of expanding their operations, maybe even moving outside of India. So basically engaging in the kinds of practices that FDI policy was in fact designed to encourage, meaning it was designed to bring in multinational firms, but in a way that would help Indian companies to grow, expand, get closer to the technological frontier, and sort of address much of the moribundity that many saw had characterized the latter parts of the previous sort of development models. So he said, some of these companies, some of our companies want to do that, but some of these other companies, they're just trading. And this now I'm sort of almost quoting. He said, they're not really, not really truly interested in technology. They're just interested in trade, and they just see these opportunities to enter these joint ventures as an opportunity to just make a little money. So as a speculative venture. So he drew this distinction, and now here I'll quote directly, between what he referred to as companies with trading orientations versus companies with production orientations. And he sort of was very clear. He's like, look, this is a sharp distinction between these two categories of firms. And so this was really fascinating. So I remember leaving the discussion and thinking, this is very interesting. It's clearly very important, but what does he really mean? And what I found was that increasingly after that was articulated in that particular way in that discussion, I realized that many of the other people I've been speaking to have been saying similar things. And in fact, even in the business press, you could identify this kind of distinction that was often being made. So this is another explanation actually for why the work became very historical, because it became important to sort of make sense of what is this distinction? Where is it coming from? And most importantly, why is it so powerful? Why does it have so much, and this is where Durkheim comes in, so much meaning, right? Why does it resonate so deeply with different actors in the Indian political economy, such that it has, effects, I argue, ultimately in policy design. So this is the turn to Durkheim, because Durkheimian sort of sociology offers a way to think about the role of meaning in society, how it emerges historically, the ways in which it shapes belief systems, and then ultimately has real effects, for example, in my case, in the policy domain. So Durkheim, certainly along with other sort of key figures in the 19th century, Marx, Weber, and so forth, play an important role in the book. But Durkheim's framework I found to be particularly useful in trying to make sense of the material that I was getting in the field.
That is very, very well explained. In fact, I was about to come to the sort of trading orientation and production orientation for this question. You've actually answered the question before I could ask it. And that is interesting because what I wanted to also get into it is uh, when you read the literature on economic nationalism, economic liberalism, economic reform in India, uh, you could be reading sort of an insider's account. So, for example, Bontek Singh Ahluwalia published 6 years ago fascinating book called Backstage, where he talked about the entire process, of how the reform was brought out. You could also be reading things from Bimal Jalan and others, and you get a sense from the Indian perspective. And then you could take a sort of a walk outside, Patrick French writing about India at the 50th year anniversary in 1997, 1998. That gives you a rather political. This is a very interesting book because you get the politics, you get policy, you get business, and you do something which is remarkable. There is a counterintuitive claim that you make in the book. The distinction of the trading orientation and the production orientation is mapped out between the foreign domestic divide rather than being absolutely categorically clear. The common assumption that we have that economic nationalism is fundamentally about promoting domestic capital from foreign competition, safeguarding it. But what you're saying, it's way more complicated than that. That Indian firms could be condemned as traders and speculators just as readily as foreign multinationals.
Yeah.
You have ample examples in the book. I mean, the Coca-Cola example that you cite is fantastic because Mr. Chauhan gets asked by George Fernandez, hey, we kicked out this multinational for you. What happened? You gave away the company in 60 million. What went wrong with you? But then the question that comes up and the answer that you give in that is that Chauhan just couldn't do anything about it because even if he wanted to fight, Coca-Cola was taking away the bottlers, it was taking away the people who had to sell it at specific points, and there is no guardrail. It's not like the government of India says, hey, okay, now that you're back, this is how you're going to compete in this market.
Yeah.
So the question that comes up is how do we think about economic nationalism as a concept anymore? I mean, is it still nationalism in any meaningful sense, or has it completely changed? And another follow up question to that,
Yeah.
is it really unique in when I was reading your book, and of course I can see something of Indonesia, I can see something of Vietnam, but then when I sit back, I'm like, no, none of these cases actually tell the Indian story. So, is there a global example that we can draw from this? Sorry
Yeah,
for a
sure.
very long question.
Yeah, no problem. So first, I'll say something about economic nationalism, and then I'll say how I think that India is both an exemplary case, but also a representative case, which again is a little bit of a paradox, maybe. So on economic nationalism, so absolutely agreed with what you said. So so first, it's useful to say when I was doing this research, it's really funny. And this maybe might be helpful for many of Professor Sabmal, when she was introducing us, sort of noted, other younger scholars and so forth who may listen to this. So when I was doing this work initially, and I was a PhD student, and here I was really interested in economic nationalism. And a very strong view was that why are you studying economic nationalism? I mean, what that's like dead. That's like something from, decades ago. So of course, sitting where we are today, that's really funny. So that's maybe one sort of insight is, it's sometimes very hard, but trust your instincts, I suppose, and go with what you're interested in. I guess is the bigger thing, because you never know what the future holds. Okay. Um, but so I was really interested in economic nationalism because, quite frankly, I saw policies that were being enacted in India, but in China, in Brazil, in South Africa. So it's really quite nationalist. But as you note, the common view or understanding of economic nationalism really was that economic nationalism, almost one to one, translates to support for domestic actors, domestic firms, especially in the industrial policy context, which is what I was interested in. And very quickly in my work, I realized that that was really kind of a very sort of overly simplistic way of thinking about nationalism. Because in the Indian context, and also quite honestly in China at the time as well, because in the 2000s, the late 90s and the 2000s, the role of multinational capital was crucial. It was widely recognized as crucial in Chinese industrial development. In fact, it's amusing to me. I mean, if it weren't just so generally tragic what we're seeing in the global economy, but it's amusing to some extent sitting in the United States and hearing many sort of like politicians and sort of observers and, sort of like you mentioned, pink press, sort of pink paper writers and so forth go on about, China's taking advantage of us, because the whole model back then was a partnership essentially between for American capital and Chinese firms. So, China's success sort of worked as to some degree was supposed to. This was the neoliberal model, firmly encapsulated in China's WTO accession and so forth. Anyways, so much of the way in which economic nationalism was seen was about supporting domestic firms. But what I could very clearly see in India, but also in other places, the economic nationalism for many, in many contexts, was about a broader idea of facilitating industrial transformation. And as part of that facilitating industrial transformation, there was a recognition by many sort of policy elites, which are kind of the key actors I sort of focus on, that you needed foreign capital. So on one hand, a very clear recognition that foreign capital could be deeply problematic. It could be neo-imperial in a variety of ways, both in the contemporary moment, but obviously we know from the past. It could result in sort of displacement of local firms, of local capital. It could result in various forms of monopoly, etc. So there are lots of concerns with the potential negative aspects of foreign capital. And this tends to be what's coded as economic nationalism, right? The sort of fear of the foreign for these reasons. But that's only half the story. At the same time, there's a recognition that you need foreign capital because you need a capital. So in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, I mean, at least the first half of the 2000s, most developing countries, including even places like China, are capital starved, right? And so you need external capital flows, unless you have a machine to really generate and extract capital domestically, which is maybe a little bit more the China story. But if you're Brazil, if you're South Africa, Vietnam, to mention some of the places that you've noted, Thailand, etc., you need foreign capital. I mean, the South Korean success, Taiwanese success, generation before was really built to a significant degree on marrying foreign capital with the emerging sort of domestic firms. So you need it for finance, but you also need multinational firms for technology. Again, there's long been a recognition, and in India, this goes back to the Nehruvian period, but also even before. This is one of the reasons I went back to the 19th century, even back to the managing agencies, because early Indian economic nationalists in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and the first couple of decades of the 20th century recognized that even though these managing agencies were doing all these problematic things, they're extractive in a variety of ways and so on, but they still were facilitating the emergence of manufacturing industry. And so this is a fundamental tension that you need multinational firms for finance, you need them for technology, yet you recognize that they could be neo-imperial, they could be monopolistic. And so how do you navigate this tension? For me, is the sort of fascinating reality of the politics of foreign investment. And then when you map that on, to go back to what we were saying before, to these concerns about Indian companies, in the Indian case, do they have trade? Are they really, really sort of true industrialists on one hand? Are they just traders and speculators on the other? Then you get this much more sort of complex, overlapping set of tensions, which I try to summarize with a little table in the book as a means to show that economic nationalism is not just about resisting the foreign and supporting the domestic. Economic nationalism in different moments in time is about a national vision of transformation, industrial, economic, and ultimately social, and then designing policy tools to try to navigate between the realities of ensuring as best as possible that you encourage, facilitate, incentivize, we can choose different adjectives, the kinds of behavior you want from firms, both foreign and domestic, and then also constrain to the kinds of positive behaviors you want to support that. But you also want to constrain the potentially negative behaviors. So in the multinational context, you don't want them to become monopolistic. You want to ensure that they bring as modern, as new, as cutting edge technologies as possible. But then for domestic companies, similarly, you want to facilitate the sort of productive kinds of activities and constrain the activities that are seen as just trade and just speculation.
Right. So, I mean, the 1830s to 1947 is a very interesting period. But what really gets me excited about this particular book is a very interesting argument you make, which is again sort of contrary to what we've been told about economic history of India. When you talk about Gandhi and Nehru, Gandhi had an utopian vision, uh, less machines, village republics, so on and so forth. And then you had Nehru on the other hand, who was all about uh, dams and factories are the temples of modern India, sort of a quote from him. So, but you say that no, that's not true. Uh, they had different economic vision, but they shared certain fundamental assumptions about India's pre-colonial economic orthodoxies. And also, it then goes back to the extractive model. But if both Gandhi and Nehru are operating within a shared moral framework about legitimate and illegitimate economic actors, and if the vision that were not all that fundamentally different, then it's not as consequential as literature has assumed, or are there still marked differences in how we should interpret it? Because uh, that's the smallest of the assumption in this makes a huge difference. So, how do we kind of do this comparator with this shared framework? Because it comes back to haunt us in 1991.
Yeah, absolutely. No, so I'm glad you raised the Gandhi sort of discussion in, I think it's maybe in chapter 3 of the book. So it was important for me, both because of the kind of subject area material, but also the empirical scope of the book, to engage with the role of Nehru and Gandhi, who are obviously two sort of founding fathers of sort of modern India. But what I found was, again, the common way that Nehru and Gandhi are often deployed in works on development, in economic history, and so forth, is in tension with one another. And I thought that framing, which you kind of mentioned, really missed a lot of really important things and was really gave us almost like a sort of shrouded the way in which we might make sense of this period in a couple of ways. Um, so first, as many know, Nehru and Gandhi had a very close personal relationship, and that can oftentimes get lost in the kind of big, sort of paradigmatic, sort of tensions, so to speak, between a kind of Gandhianism, which is small scale, village based on one hand, and a kind of Nehruvianism, which is large scale, and as you said, temples and factories as the new temples of modern India. So I wanted to push back against that to some extent. Secondly, in the book, I frame this distinction between both foreign and domestic firms, or these categories of foreign and domestic firms on one hand that are just doing trade and speculation, these categories that are seen as more productive and sort of true industrialists. I frame those as traditional and modern. And so, as you can imagine, with a framework that is articulated as traditional and modern, and with a chapter that's on Nehru and Gandhi, it's very easy to sort of slot Gandhi, in the sort of traditional category and Nehru in the modern category. And again, that kind of maps onto, many of the ways in which these kind of key historical figures are often deployed. And I thought that was misleading, and I'll say why. And the sort of Gandhi is really sort of crucial here, because what I argue in the book, and I build on a number of scholars who've done really path-breaking work here, is that it's a mistake to think about Gandhi's view of village industry as narrowly traditional, as a return to villages, as anti-industry, as anti-modern. In fact, what I argue in the book is that Gandhi's idea of village industry um, was a particular kind of modernity. So this is important as a kind of argument, both in the Indian context, but it's also more important as a more general argument about what is modernity. Because again, the common view of a common view rather of modernity is that when one says what is modern, what is traditional, what is a modernity, it immediately signals a particular kind of Western modernity, a modernity that maps on to 18th and 19th century Europe, and the kinds of transformations coming from the Enlightenment and going through the Industrial Revolution that took place in the European continent. This is also a bit problematic in many respects, right? It's Eurocentric, because it sort of equates rather modernity with Eurocentricity and with Europe and with the Enlightenment, or the European Enlightenment. And this is wrong. I think what Gandhi was doing, in fact, if one looks at much of his philosophical writing, but then even if one thinks about the activities that he was promoting in villages, instead it promoted a particular kind of modernity, a modernity that for Gandhi was centered in India. And it tied very closely with earlier Indian economic nationalists, people like, Dadabhai Naoroji, with R.C. Dutt and others, for whom the idea that India was ahead of Europe prior to the arrival of the British is a crucial bedrock of Indian economic nationalism. So here the notion is that the British arrival essentially derailed what would be a sort of natural, what would have otherwise been a natural industrial revolution in India, through the imposition of free trade with the East India Company, which sort of destroyed the artisanal sector and so forth, right? So much of that we sort of know, but it's important, I think, to highlight, and I try to do this in the book, that these ideas are really core to Indian economic nationalism, generally going back to the 19th century. But then also you can see how it animated, for example, Gandhi's ideas, because it allowed the space to make the credible argument that there is a particular kind of Indian modernity which predates colonialism. And what Gandhi was trying to promote was an idea that we can draw on these earlier um, sort of ideas of what is modern, and they can be articulated through a framework that allows for industrialization, allows for growth, but with a model that's not Western in the way that was often seen to be ascribed to sort of a sort of typical industrial modernity. So taking a step back out of India for a moment, this is an important, I think, point to make in sort of development more broadly. That is important whether we think about development in India, development in in Africa, in Latin America, in other parts of Asia. that in fact there are multiple modernities that are often being developed and advanced in many of these spaces that may or may not map on to sort of European ideas of modernity, but instead often are products of local context, local social dynamics, local culture, and local experiences with colonialism and imperialism. And so the goal of that chapter really was to open up that space to recognize that there are multiple modernities. Many times these modernities are in conflict, not just between the foreign and the domestic, which again, if we think about the colonial period and anti-colonial actions in India, it's very much coded as Indian anti-colonial actors versus the British, which I mean is partly true for sure, but it also can occlude the extent to which there are different ideas of nationalism and different ideas of modernity, even within the Indian anti-colonial movement. Of course, many of these different strands would become more clear, post-independence. But even at this time, it was important for me to sort of try to um, make clear that in the framework that I was providing in the book writ large, that there was a lot of space for, in fact, lots of evidence of these kinds of internal tensions around economic nationalism, Indian economic nationalism, and specifically around what constitutes an Indian modernity.
Sorry, I had a phone there for a minute. Um, so I'm now going to slightly jump 30 years
Yeah,
because a long period to cover. But I'm going to come back to this. The question about modernity is sort of central to the arguments that you're making in the book. Uh, A, the story of Coca-Cola, you refer to it in the introduction, then it kind of is a thread throughout the sort of the different narratives. Coca-Cola is not the only company you talk about. Honda, Hero Honda, uh, Bajaj, Kinetic Honda, doomed in a way. But Coca-Cola is that central narrative. So, A, as a writer, how happy were you when you found this perfect little piece, which kind of worked as a sort of a theory? Because it's like that magic brick, it goes everywhere, bolsters your argument. So, one is that from just the writing perspective.
sure.
Uh, and the second question, and the larger question around it, is the character of George Fernandez,
Yes.
not the not just the politician, but also what he stood for. In a way, George Fernandez was a very confused politician. Confused in the sense that he was very convinced and very convincing of his ideas as a socialist leader who was part of the anti Indira Gandhi agitation, part of the student movement, did a lot of fantastic work as a labor leader. But the idea that he was borrowing was largely a Eurocentric idea. And the idea of co opting a technology, uh, it's not that intellectual property is not an Indian tradition because we've had a patent office for a very long period of time.
Hmm.
For a company like Coca Cola, uh, their entire argument is that, you know what, we have this super secret formula that we're not going to give to anybody. But then the government makes a case that if you don't give it, then get out. So this person, this confused technocrat, bureaucrat, politician, leader, who also embodies the piecemeal way the Indian economic system works. You want to modernize, you don't want to let a foreign company dictate to you. You're going to kick them out, but you're not going to build any kind of guardrail for the company that you want to succeed. In this case, the parlays. It's you've made enough money, but the government is not going to give you any policy. So tell me about this contradictory take on modernism, because I think Gandhi and Nehru were very clear philosophically, but it is the policy and the practice of this modernism which comes across as, for lack of a better word, very haphazard, chaotic.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's this haphazard, seeming haphazard and chaotic nature that is, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, the very, very beginning of the book, right? The opening anecdote with the Economist piece that I hope to kind of address. So I have a slightly more sympathetic view towards George Fernandez, which I'll say more about in a
No, no,
moment.
no. I have a sympathetic view as well. Go ahead.
But I'll just say something first about the Coca-Cola, as a kind of analytic device, rhetorical device, or so it's interesting. I don't so the story about Coca-Cola in the 1970s, I thought it goes back to again earlier parts of our conversation. I was describing how the whole project sort of emerged. So as it became a little bit slightly more historical, so the 1970s, Coke for me was like the Coke story, the Coke Thumbs Up story. Seemed great. And by the way, it's not only Coke and Thumbs Up. So IBM, of course, was the other foreign multinational, American multinational specifically, that was famously kicked out right around that same time in 77 for not really complying with fairer rules. And my colleague at MIT, Dwight Banerjee, has a brand new book on the history of computing in India, which sort of really centers IBM in really interesting ways. And I'll come back to IBM because it's important in terms of what does it mean for the kinds of support that is provided or not for emerging firms. So why doesn't India have a good, a sort of successful computing hardware sector is the puzzle after IBM, right? Okay, but coming back to Coca-Cola. So it was really fascinating and ended up being quite useful because it really mapped onto the kind of 1970s moment, which was on one hand characterized, of course, by the twin oil crises, more generally, sort of economic disruptions globally, rising inflation, slowing growth, and a lot of geopolitical tensions, including around the Vietnam War, which India was very much entangled in those tensions with the US. At the same time, it was receiving food aid and so forth. So it really encapsulated, I thought, in really crucial ways, the sort of tumultuous 1970s globally, but also with very kind of Indian centric elements, because not only were there these disruptions happening globally, a real strong period of anti-imperialism in the global stage, the emergence of the new international economic order, this attempt by many developing countries to sort of really establish their sovereignty with respect to the US, Europe, and Japan, probably should also be in that category as well, and the Soviet Union. But in India, it kind of manifested, or it seemed to be sort of kicking out of Coca-Cola seemed to be an emblematic of this sort of broader movement. Meaning, Coca-Cola at the time was the multinational. It was the representative of large-scale American capital, more so, I think, even than General Motors or even ExxonMobil. Really was Coca-Cola, because not only was it gigantic as a firm, but its cultural power was crucial. I mean, it represented, again, to use the kind of modernity, a particular kind of American modernity. That kind of like 1960s, convertible down, couple driving down a road. This was a sort of like American freedom in the middle of the Cold War, right? It was exemplified by Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola was powerful as a large firm in kind of structural ways, but even more so, I think, culturally, as a kind of cultural icon of American liberalism in the midst of the Cold War. So Coca-Cola getting kicked out was crucial, was really fascinating for that reason. And then its return, it's gets kicked out. Thumbs Up emerges. Thumbs Up, similarly in India, I mean, I'm going to hazard to say, also is this gigantic cultural force, right? So it's not just about the size of Thumbs Up, meaning it grew to dominate. When Coke was kicked out, there was no plan to sort of support, new, as far as I understand, new Indian soft drink companies, but a bunch emerged. And of the number that emerged, Coca-Cola, Thumbs Up, and of course also Limca, so the two key brands that the Chan brothers developed, just more to dominate the market. And again, Thumbs Up really captured the 1980s moment. So this goes back to my saying that I began the whole project in the 1980s, partly because there were key efforts to liberalize foreign investment in the 80s. I mentioned the two-wheeler and light commercial vehicle joint ventures as kind of key examples. But also the 1980s was a period of what I refer to in the book as aspirational consumerism. First on the Indira Gandhi, and then really accelerating on the Rahul Gandhi afterwards. This kind of period when there was this kind of idea that India is transforming. And Thumbs Up captured that moment. So these consumer brands are hugely important, again, both structurally but also culturally. The Thumbs Up is kind of ideal there. But probably the most important thing is that I found when I present early versions of the work that the one thing everybody would get really excited about or most excited about, and I always remember, was when I told the Coca-Cola Thumbs Up story. As you know, as a sort of scholar, giving presentations and kind of reading the room, it was a moment everybody straightened up. People started smiling. Everyone leaned forward. It was really quite striking. And afterwards, people would always say, half the questions I would get would be about Coke and Thumbs Up. And people would always say, you have to say more about the Coke and Thumbs Up story. So also a lot of it was that it was definitely helpful to me in terms of the kind of analytic work that it did in sort of capturing this moment, but also it just really seemed to resonate with people, both people who were either Indian, whether from India or in the diaspora, and sort of knew Thumbs Up, that very closely because they drank a lot of Thumbs Up and loved it, but also even people who may not have been familiar with Thumbs Up, but of course the Coca-Cola element was really striking. The final thing I'll just say, I'll try to just say quickly, which again goes to the kind of core argument in the book, but again was why Thumbs Up is, I think, really kind of generative, is what happened in the 1990s, right? So as you note, Coca-Cola comes back in the 90s. Pepsi is also in the markets. They're competing, and then there's this fear by the Jahan brothers about their ability to compete with these two multinationals. And then there are a bunch of structural things that happen, right? Coke really starts to capture the distribution network that Thumbs Up relied upon. As I know, from the way that you characterize this, but I'll just say for others who may be listening, big sort of drinks brands like Coke, Thumbs Up, Limca, etc., tend not to own their distribution network. Those tend to be independently owned and control the bottlers and so on. But they exert control because they have the brand that everybody wants to drink. But that also makes them very vulnerable to takeover. So this is one of the ways in which Coca-Cola was really putting pressure, and Pepsi were really putting pressure on Thumbs Up. But what's interesting is that the Chan brothers feel pressure to sell. They eventually sell. They don't really want to sell the company. So I cite in the book a really interesting line from the guy who at the time was the kind of local Coca-Cola manager. He later became, this is Neville Isdell, later became CEO of Coke, where he says, at the contract signing in Atlanta, Ramesh Chauhan and his wife cried, So really, and I thought it was important to sort of say because, Fernandez, as you know, kind of is like, you guys sold out. You sold out the company, you sold out India, right? You sold the company for 60 million, you sold India for 60 million. But it's important to note that, this was very clearly a difficult decision. But it also speaks to this broader question of how do you make sense of the Chauhan brothers? So are they, as I describe in the book, or framing in the book, these kind of intrepid entrepreneurs who took advantage of, who, when there was a market opportunity, developed this, super brand that went on to great success. But then as soon as the going gets rough, they sell out. So are they just like traders? Or are they like real industrialists that, use their entrepreneurial skills, entrepreneurial know to develop this, powerful brand, and then are just, unable to resist the structural power of the big American multinationals? This, I thought, in a nutshell, with all the cultural elements that make the Thumbs Up and Coca-Cola story interesting, really capture the core of the kind of argument that this is this tension at play. And I note very briefly in the book, but I always try to say it when I talk about it, that even for those questions about the Chauhan brothers, are they really traders? Are they industrialists? We should remember that what does Ramesh Chauhan go on to then develop later on? It was the Bisleri brand. Right, which as I say in the book, and of course, everyone in India knows, asking for a bottle of water is basically asking for Bisleri, right? So it becomes like Xerox, like I'm going to take a Xerox copy. It's that same power. So he kind of does it again in many respects, and so that's less to kind of that's more to just make this point that it's this sort of categorization of business actors is on one hand central, I think, to the political economy of India and sort of more broadly in other places. But also, is this a real tension? And it's oftentimes difficult to tell.
Right. So we are about to hit the 1 hour mark in 9 minutes, and it's been a fascinating conversation. So runway to the last few questions because we would want to wrap it around 1 hour 15 minutes. cognitive dissonance is very real in the age of AI. People don't really want to listen to very wrong things. But I think it's an important conversation. Uh, what you just categorized about the Chauhan brothers and the way this entire ontology of technology transfer, scaling up, distribution, all of this comes together beautifully in, I think, I have not read any other work on joint ventures. So this is my first work. And but when I asked around, there are some technical monographs on it in a way, but
Hmm.
there is nothing really of this nature. So what you're able to do is you're able to map out the joint venture pathway. As an Indian, born in this era, though very young at that point of time to know about it. But looking back, pivotal moment 1991, pivotal moment 2002 to 2010, that economic liftoff.
Yep.
But all of it is made possible with this joint venture. The behemoths that we see today, Tata, uh, huge corporate. But Tata was also part of a JV.
Yep.
Mahindra and Mahindra, they were also part of a JV.
Yep. Ford.
Of course, yeah, Ford, and I mean they also had sort of technology transfer going back for a very long time for that Jeep that they had. The
Hmm.
iconic Mahindra Jeep.
Yep. Wiley's.
Yeah. So, but the way you map it out, it becomes very, very clear that this was not just a place for technology transfer. This is also the place for the moral ambiguity or the moral landscape to play out. And I'm specifically now talking about that entire CII sort of posturing that happened around, oh, you know what, these MNCs, they're just aggressive, let us do it. And you kind of do it beautifully between Pallavi Shroff and I think
Amit
Mr.
Mitra. Mr.
Yeah,
Mitra.
Amit
Yes.
Mitra, Mr. Mitra. And it's amazing because the point that both of them are making are legitimate points, but the sort of the moral landscape of it, you don't really think about corporations as backdrops for moral reasoning. Take us a little bit through this process. How did it happen? Because it's not these two people. It starts with A.N. Verma sitting in the Prime Minister's office,
Yep.
one of the most important bureaucrats in the country.
Yep.
From there, and then you map it out to different bureaucrats who are taking positions. Somebody siding with Shroff, somebody siding with Mr. Mitra, and then boom, you suddenly have IT happens, and that changes the conversation all over again. Take us through this process.
Yeah, sure. So as I said earlier in our conversation, I just find joint ventures to be totally fascinating. Maybe that's just, very scholarly and nerdy of me. I don't know, because as you rightly say, there's a lot of work on joint ventures in the business literature, which is very important and very helpful, but it tends to be more dry, right? So it's really for people who are interested in these kinds of organizational sort of stories or economics and so on. And even in those spaces, it's not. And so I think that's unfortunate because I think joint ventures really capture much of these kinds of dynamics, these politics, these tensions. Again, in many different contexts, but certainly in India. So the specific dynamic you're sort of referring to between Pallavi Shroff and Amit Mitra, basically when he was Pallavi Shroff, of course, head of Amershon Mangla, so the leading, what's seen as the leading Indian corporate law firm. On one hand, interesting, a colleague of mine who's a historian, Rohit Dey. We were just giving a book talking. He was giving a response to the book and sort of noted that, oh, did you know that she's actually Jagdish Bhagwati's niece? So Jagdish Bhagwati, of course, a famous Indian economist based at Columbia University, who, along with his colleague T.N. Srinivasan, are right, the sort of some of the most influential sort of liberal views on Indian economics in the 80s and 90s. Anyways, so the specific thing that they're debating goes back to this Press Note 18 that I mentioned earlier. As you mentioned, so in the 1990s, there was this kind of tension between, the sort of Bombay Club and CII under Tarun Das. On one hand, making these claims about multinationals behaving unethically and not really being interested in long-term development in India. But of course, like you use the term posturing, by virtue of saying that, sort of saying, well, or us Indian companies, we are we want to be the agents of transformation. We have the capacities, but we need the help in order to deal with these multinationals. And by the help, we need policy support. And so they get this policy support in various forms, one of which is Press Note 18, which sort of shifts the balance of power within these joint ventures, back towards Indian companies to some significant degree. But what happens? So Press Note 18 is in 1998. What happens over the course of the next 7 years is that, on one hand, in some cases, Press Note 18 is seen to be working as intended, meaning that it is providing a more level playing field between Indian and foreign joint venture partners. So great. But on the other hand, what became a kind of complaint that increasingly emerged came from the multinational side, where they said, look, many of their Indian joint venture partners are basically demanding payments, essentially, to exit our joint ventures. So maybe I say a little bit more about that. What do I mean? So the complaint from CII and the Bombay Club was that the multinational firms are basically kicking the local firms out using a bunch of legal financial mechanisms. So accelerated. So I give the example, for instance, of talking to another set of lawyers who, in our conversation, and I cite this in the book, talk a lot about basically say that this is what happens. So multinational firms, if they want to get rid of their local partner because the foreign investment rules have changed, maybe now they can own 75% or maybe 100%. So why do they still need a local partner? Maybe they don't need them anymore. They think they don't need them anymore. But they're in a contractual relationship. So what they'll do is they'll say, look, we want to, increase our investments in the joint venture. So far we both invested $20 million each, but now we want to invest 100 million or 200 million. And so the Indian company, in many cases, will say, we can't access that level of. So this is in the 1990s. So that's maybe nowadays that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but that's a lot of money. And so they'll say we can't raise that kind of capital because we're smaller, or we're also operating in a constrained capital market environment in India, whereas the multinational firms, they're global, so they have access to global capital. So this is a fundamental imbalance. It's a structural imbalance between multinational firms and Indian companies, especially in the 1990s. And so the foreign company will say, well, okay, too bad, you can't keep up the investment, so then you just get diluted. And so it's a way in which they're squeezed out. So you can see how this might be interpreted as, and probably in reality is seen as, a bigger firm just squeezing out its local partner. So it's seen as a kind of unethical behavior. This is not the way you treat your partner, right? A joint venture is a partnership, it's a marriage, it's a meeting of equals, et cetera, et cetera. It should be, give and take. It should be mutually beneficial. And this is not complying with those kinds of normative goals of the joint venture. Hence, Press Note 18. But what happens after Press Note 18 is a lot of multinational companies say, look, many of our Indian companies, they don't really want to grow the company any bigger. But now that there's Press Note 18, they're demanding a payment in order to sign the non-objection certificate. And so one of my favorite quotes in the book is from a sort of senior finance ministry interviewee who basically said they take a bribe, which I thought was endlessly interesting because, of course, the long-standing view of the Indian bureaucrat is that they're taking bribes, suitcases of cash, corruption, and so forth. And here it is, this bureaucrat is saying these companies are taking bribes, basically. So I thought it was a fascinating, just sort of rhetorically. But anyways, but the core thing really was, there basically were the multinationals were saying that local companies are being extractive. Now, to take a step back, what's the problem from the policy perspective? Leaving aside the, the sort of, when my interviewee said they take a bribe, I mean, he said it with a little half laugh, right? So he recognized the humor. But from a more serious perspective, what was the issue? Well, the problem is that the goal of joint ventures, let's remember, was to facilitate technology transfer. It was to enable Indian companies to grow. And this requires two things. It requires both parties to sort of play their role. It requires the multinational firm to bring good technologies and share them, right? But it also requires the local partner to try to absorb those technologies. To the extent that the foreign partner is not playing their role, so they're not bringing new technologies or they're trying to squeeze out their local partner, that's a problem. You need a policy solution. But to the extent the local partner may also, perhaps in some cases, not be playing their role, then they become coded as having just trading orientations, as seeing joint ventures as a speculative venture. Because let's recall, in 1991, when the government allows investment up to 51%, almost by default, it means that multinational firms, in order to enter India, have to find a local partner. So what does this mean? It means that on the Indian company side, all of a sudden there's an opportunity where lots of multinationals want to come in and they're searching for partners. So you could be the kind. So now I'm going to frame this in the way that my interlocutors who see these distinctions frame it. You could be an Indian company that is desperately wanted these new technologies because you always wanted to grow. You maybe feel constrained by the license Raj, etc. Like you could be of that view. So now it's a great opportunity. These foreign firms are coming. You can partner with them, and you can finally get access to capital and technology. Great. But you might also be the kind of firm that is just says, oh, well, these guys are coming in. They're going to invest a bunch of money. Maybe I'll put some money in as well. Now I'm almost quoting from, again, another interview. I'll put some money in as well. And I'll just ride along. So I'll let basically the foreign firm do all of the work. They have the technology. I'll put in a little bit of money. But they're going to really do all the work. And I'll just basically accrue the profits that come from the joint venture. And so it's for these firms that when Press Note 18 is introduced, and the multinational wants to get bigger, these guys maybe don't really want to get much bigger. This is the interpretation. And so they say to their multinational partner, fine, if you want to grow, if you want to invest more, that's okay. If you want to dilute me, but you have to pay me if you want to exit. And so this is exactly what Pallavi Shroff was arguing. Amit Mitra is basically saying, look, there's an unequal playing field. These multinational firms engage in all these unethical business practices. They use their structural power to squeeze out their local partners. Uses the Hero Honda example to kind of animate his claims, which was very salient at the time, because Hero is seen as this sort of captain of industry, went from bicycle manufacturing in Punjab to the biggest two-wheeler company in India, and now they're getting squeezed by Honda. This is unfair. They need help on one hand. So that's Amit Mitra's example. But Pallavi Shroff uses the example of these firms that are just demanding these payments, essentially. And I sort of cite the next policy shift that takes place as a reflection of the salience, I think, of this counterclaim. Because in 2005, Press Note 18 is revised with Press Note 1, which basically limits the ability to use the joint venture, to use required non-objection certificates. And then a few years later, I think in 2009, it's done away with completely. And so this kind of argument that took place between Shroff and Mitra, really kind of captured the sort of zeitgeist of the time, this kind of tension that was at play, and very much around the kind of moral ambiguity around Indian business actors as well as foreign firms. As well as, I'll mention this very quickly, finally, for those people who are interested in like law and sort of legal things. But again, to sort of signal that this is not just about what's happening in India, but this is a kind of global story. This is still in the period, which now seems like a long time ago, of neoliberalism and globalization. And Pallavi Shroff, in her arguments publicly, really centers on a key mechanism of neoliberalism, which is contract. She says, look, these are two contracting parties. They have a contract between them, and it's not the role of the state to intervene in contracts between private consenting parties. This is a big sort of like neoliberal claim, right? This is a claim that we have markets, which are these sort of sanctified spaces, and you have the state over here, and the two should remain separate. At best, the state should provide a broad level conducive environment for markets to work, right? So this is one view, a sort of state market separation view. And effectively, this is what Pallavi Shroff is sort of arguing. She's like arguing non-intervention, right? The state has no business to get into these relationships that are governed by these private contracts. On the other hand, there is a view which is much more heterodox. So this is an orthodox view, this separation. There's a heterodox view that says, well, this is nonsense. There is no real separation between state and market. The state is always governing how markets work. It's always structuring the sort of the context, the activities, the tools, the resources of actors in a market, whether they're individuals or whether they're corporations and so on. And so it's not about separation, but rather thinking about, but once you recognize that the state is sort of always there, then it's about, the question is not state versus no state, but rather what role is the state playing to shape relations in markets. And this is what Amit Mitra's claim was, that the state is always there and they should act in a way that ensures equitable outcomes in these joint venture conflicts between multinational firms and their Indian counterparts.
That has given me a lot to think about. And I think for anybody who's listening to it later on, when we put it up, it's going to be a place for generating a lot of theory. Last two questions, pretty large ones. Sorry for that, but that's the nature of academia, I think.
Yeah,
Until unless we get an academia AI which does that better. Hopefully not.
it will never do better.
Uh, so when you were while you were delivering a talk on it, I think in Brown, I think Rohit and Mark were in that
Yeah.
particular.
Oh, great. So you saw the video.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
that's right. Yeah, Rohit and
Yes,
Mark,
I
right?
did.
Yes.
So both Rohit and Mark made some interesting. Rohit kind of took that argument to present day India, and he talked about sort of the speculative nature of how a lot of these things that are being protected, or the companies that are being protected, they are being protected not because they are sort of some sort of a nationalistic agenda, but there is a rent-seeking behavior involved. I think that was one of the sort of arguments that he made. But I resonate quite a lot with what Mark said, which was in the larger scheme of things. We are living through an age of financialization, everything, platform monopolies, um, the way data, etc., is being treated as an asset. Have we taken a turn in the time turner in the of the Harry Potter films and arrived at 1945? Nobody told us this, uh, because throughout your book, I'm listening to arguments from Pallavi Shroff. I'm listening to how economic liberalization ought to be done. The thing about contract that you just said, but you wake up in 2026 and you're like, Donald Trump is going haywire, doing and saying things from an economic logic of the state.
Yep.
And it's absolutely fine. It's capiche. Had this been done in 1980s by Indira Gandhi, they would have run her out of the United Nations, perhaps.
Yes.
So, how did we arrive here? I mean, neoliberal model working fine, working fine, working fine. Suddenly, one fine day, the wheels fall off.
Yeah. So I think so. Super question. So I think for many, for some, the neoliberal machine may have been working fine, but for others, it wasn't. And I think that is maybe always the case under capitalism, that there are distributional inequities, right? And so I think what becomes important, again, coming back to the framework that I advance in the book, about really a kind of moral framework, is how those inequalities, capitalism's fundamental inequalities. So now we can go back to Marx, but even Smith, really. But of course, Marx is the sort of key figure here in, highlighting the fundamental inequalities that are in capitalism. So capitalism, for Marx, is on one hand an incredible system because it generates all these productivity gains, but at the same time, it's this horrific system because it generates all these inequalities, and that is a fundamental tension in capitalism. And so in our neoliberal moment, we see this tension manifesting as well, where you're getting a lot of growth. So you mentioned, in India in the 2000s, getting into the 20 teens, this is like a period of like very rapid growth, 6-7% in India, similar in China and Brazil, in the sort of global south is growing very, very rapidly at this time. But even, rich countries, Japan is still a bit stagnant, but I mean, the US, Europe, at least up until the financial crisis, are also growing well. So the global economy is booming in many respects in this period. But the gains and losses from this boom, of course, are not evenly distributed. So to talk about Trump and the United States, for example, I mean, so this we sort of all know now. With what one of my colleagues at MIT, David Otter, and his colleague Gordon Hans referred to as the China shock, is taking place, meaning there's an acceleration of deindustrialization in the United States. This generates lots of job losses, especially in industrial areas. Um, and so you have a lot of disaffected people who, very interestingly, could have gone in different ways. So a very famous uh, way to think about this so now we're talking a little bit of the American politics and American political economy, but like you said, it matters for all of us globally, unfortunately. But in the run up to the 2016 elections, this is the election when Trump ultimately wins against Hillary Clinton. In the primaries, sorry, the detail for people who aren't familiar with American political system. So in order to run for president, one of the two major parties, you have to do a primary. I know that you know this, but just for our listeners. And so there's a competition, within the party to see who will be the sort of lead the party. And the two key protagonists, of course, on the Democratic side were Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. So Hillary Clinton, who represented neoliberalism fully, in many ways, and Bernie Sanders, who was a sort of the left, sort of democratic socialist, who had a lot of traction, and he had a lot of traction amongst many people in the U.S., but not just as people might think, young people in the kind of like coastal elites and so forth, but actually precisely in the places that were deindustrializing, amongst the sort of American male blue collar worker. Because his argument really resonated, because he was centering the role of labor and the kind of losses that have been experienced and so forth with sort of globalization and so on. So Bernie Sanders, loses to Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump. One of the really interesting things, kind of says, as he's struggling to kind of build traction on the Republican Party primary, says, let's go get the Bernie people. So the kind of idea that this group of people were sort of available and sort of amenable to arguments both from the left about deindustrialization, the sort of negative effects of globalization and capitalism, but also from the far right. So both Trump and Sanders, in many ways, are critiquing sort of globalization, neoliberalism, many ways in which capitalism was playing out at the time, but obviously from very different implications about what to do with it, a very different normative basis, of course. But Trump says, let's go get the Bernie people. So why do I give that framing? Well, it's simply to say that what Trump deployed in 2016, and again, over the last couple of years when he was out of power before he won again, was very much a moral argument. He's saying, look, we have been treated unfairly. The whole tariff thing, what does he keep saying? We have been treated unfairly. He has this idea of fairness. It's hard to say this in a straight face, because the idea of, as somebody who studies development, and I'm from Jamaica originally, the idea that America has been treated unfairly by other countries in the world is laughable, right? But it's a salient argument. Like, people have bought the argument, and this is what he deploys. So he's very much, in my view, framing his, sort of chaotic, in many respects, attempts at putting in place all these tariffs and sort of restructuring the global trade order in moral terms. Now, at the same time that he's doing, he's of course benefiting some in American companies in particular ways. He's benefiting his own family in other ways, maybe less on the trade side, but perhaps more so in other activities that he's involved with. This is very important to note. But nevertheless, it's all being framed in these kind of moral terms. It's about fairness. Has China been, stealing American technology? This goes back to the joint ventures, right? Remember, the joint ventures were about technology transfer, but now it's being framed as China stealing. 20 years ago, someone might say, well, this is American companies going in to exploit cheap Chinese labor, right? And so that could have been one moral framing in the late 1990s, early 2000s. In fact, from the perspective of American labor, this is precisely what American labor said, that American companies, offshoring production to China, or in many cases, moving themselves and setting up facilities in China, is not only problematic because of the losses it means for us, the American worker, but it's also problematic from a kind of global liberal solidarity perspective, because it's built on the exploitation of Chinese workers. And so, from a global labor perspective, this is exploitation. There's a problem about sort of labor exploitation by capital in different places. This was one of the arguments amongst American labor, at least strands of American labor that sort of think globally about these kinds of questions. But again, those are framed very much in sort of moral terms. So, what I try to argue in the book, just to take a step back, is to say that, as I noted in our conversation earlier, India for me is exemplary but also representative as a case. Um, but the very same kinds of analytic moves that I try to make in the book, which is to try to make sense of what is morally salient, why does it matter, where do these ideas come from, these belief systems, why are they so important, how do they have such resonance over time, what kinds of ambiguities do they generate, and how are those ambiguities sometimes exploited by particular actors in the kind of policy and political sphere, is just as valuable, I think, I hope, in the US as it is in India. And so I use one or two specific examples in the US. The kind of easy ones from the late 19th century is the Gilded Age, the robber barons, these sort of business actors. Are they just making a lot of money for themselves? Or are they helping to facilitate the American Industrial Revolution, which was a late 19th century phenomenon? Well, it was a bit of both, right? And so how do you make sense of this? And how do these guys react? Well, they react by doing lots of philanthropy. This is Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford later on in the early 20th century, and so forth. But again, 100 years later, during the financial crisis in the US, again, there was this kind of tension around bankers. These bankers have made a lot of money through engaging in these kind of risky financial activities on one hand, but when they get in trouble, it's bad for everybody, but they get bailed out. And so there's this question of how do we think about these bankers? Are they good for society? Or are they just kind of exploitative and extractive? Was very much at play actually at the same time when I was doing this field work in India. So these kinds of dynamics that were happening in the US really helped me to think about, to make sense actually of what I was learning in India. A final very quick example is tech. So again, when I was in the early parts of writing up this book, there were these similar kind of tensions in the 20 teens about technology platforms like Uber in the US and globally, Ola, like, are they just providing this amazing service using these really sophisticated technologies, or are they just engaging in labor exploitation and blatant rule breaking in municipalities? So again, there's a moral sort of tension that is very much at play in finance, in tech, as much as in the US and in other parts of the world, as much as I try to trace in a variety of industries in India over a long period of time.
That is very interesting. Primarily because you brought up Ola and Uber and other larger corporations that are now a feature of the Indian landscape. I would actually like to sort of one of the fascinating things in the book was the photographs, the advertising frameworks that you use for Padmini, sort of the backstory to that, Hindustan automobiles, and controlled by large corporations, both of them. And Padmini has a very interesting story, but perhaps later on that some other time. You use the archive in a very interesting way as a space for generating not just documentation, but also sort of art, creativity, and that entire process. One of the laments that I have as an Indian economist is that all of this happened, this entire process, but a the conversation around it has never really led to the creation of a strong middle class. You talk about Brazil, definitely they have problems, but there is a strong middle class. Thailand, it's economically it's stuck in a time loop. It has achieved to a certain extent, but now it is kind of frozen over in a very interesting sort of not a high income country, but not a poor country either. Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam. The Indonesian example, I think Mark referred to the nickel nationalism. But in India, all of this led to the creation of a small cocooned middle class, which went abroad. We have this example we kind of use as a chip on our shoulders that some of the biggest tech CEOs are Indians. But none of that kind of gets back to India. I mean,
Yeah.
great, Sundar Pichai might be doing a lot of work somewhere, but none of that is translating back. Did we, as a country, fail the economic litmus test of rent seeking versus technology production? Or is it or are you optimistic that it is not too late and perhaps we'll catch up someday?
Well, I mean, I'm always optimistic because I'm a development person. So, optimism is built into my kind of ethos and so forth. But I mean, the reality is deeply concerning, as as you precisely note. So yeah, I mean, so the relative narrowness of the Indian middle class, despite all the optimism again of the 80s and the 90s, which was seen as this emergence, this moment rather, a period of a great expansion of the middle class, and of course, for sure, there was um, important growth, but it's still, as you know, a relatively narrow and small middle class with all the problems that that sort of engenders. So how do we get past? I mean, I think this is where I would say first that I think a lot of basic interventions. Now, I'm fully going to have my development economist hat on. There are a lot of basic interventions that um, are crucial, and many people have been making these claims for a very long time. So, basic education, onto secondary education first, as means of starting to expand. And this is about distribution of flows, right? So, this is about how are the gains from economic growth and development distributed elsewhere? It's distributed rather more broadly through the economy. So I think basic education, secondary education, I think stronger labor protections as a related measure, so that as people are emerging from primary and secondary education into the workforce in a variety of spaces. So I mean, it could be in manufacturing, both in the sort of formal sector as well as in the so-called unorganized sector, or elsewhere, have greater protections, and also, more importantly, are able to capture more of the pie. So basically, through the mechanism of wages, I think is really crucial. But those are very basic kinds of interventions. So I think that's really important to know, sort of at one hand. So my book doesn't get into this at all, but that's basic development, and it may seem simple. It's also very difficult to do. It's highly politicized, but I think crucial. Um, on the other side, I think more efforts to on the other end of the spectrum, I suppose, which is more where the book sort of the space that the book occupies. I think greater efforts to um, encourage, facilitate, compel in cases technology acquisition and technology development. Again, we can use some of the familiar metrics in economics. The percentage of GDP that's spent on R&D, for example, is extremely low. So just again, as a measure of the ways in which resources are deployed, it highlights the extent to which it's not going into R&D at levels that it could, even when compared to other sort of like advanced middle income countries, to sort of use that kind of categorization. So I think that's crucial. I think, again, my background and training was in, first development economics, and then the political economy of development. When I was in grad school, of course, a lot of what we focused on was a developmental state. And so it would behoove me to say something maybe about the developmental state here, because part of the story in the book really is engaging with that sort of broad literature. But the most important element, I think, of the developmental state that is salient here is the extent to which companies, the state was able to compel firms to do continuous improvement. So to not be satisfied with levels of production that generated fixed rents, but to continuously engage in productivity improvements. And of course, the successful developmental states did this using trade policy primarily, but also investment policy and a number of other policy tools as well. I think those are crucial. Even in the sort of like leading sectors in India. So think about pharma, for example. So hugely successful in terms of generics. That is a result of a policy intervention. So you mentioned IP earlier in our conversation. That, of course, is about protecting product patents, but not protecting process patents, but not product patents. So encouraging innovation in
Yeah.
um, uh, process of developing new formulations or formulations and so forth, existing formulations, but through novel processes. That was great. But the extent to which the success of generics in the 80s, 90s, getting into the 2000s, sort of stagnated, such that many of the successful generic pharma companies have not reached the level of global pharma, is an
Yeah.
indication of um, a successful set of initial policies, but a failure to continue to evolve the policy environment in ways that would encourage these firms to continue to grow, to deepen their technological capabilities, um, such that they could get closer to the technological frontier. Pharma is a great example in India because, I mean, sort of like IT, but I think actually a better example, because it's clear that the talent is there, the engineering
Mm.
skills are there, the sort of um, educational structure to generate high quality engineers, of course, with the IITs and now many other institutions as well, has been there for a long time. But I think the missing piece is thinking about how um, those resources, human resources, financial resources, technological resources, can be further developed, and advanced, such that firms in this sector can continue to get closer to and ultimately compete with the Novartises and Merck's and so forth. There really is, in my view, little reason uh, for that not to be the case.
Right. No, I think agreed. I mean, you are optimistic, and I'm looking at it from the economic realities and the sort of dire economic nationalism surrounding us everywhere. But this is a fascinating book. Thank you very much for doing it early in the morning, I know. And this has been a fantastic conversation. So,
Absolutely. No, I
uh,
really enjoyed our conversation. I'm so pleased to have had the opportunity to speak with you. Thanks very much for the invitation to join you. And yeah, I look forward to keeping the conversation going.
thank you very
Absolutely.
much. Thank you very much for your time, Professor.
Take care. Absolutely. Thanks very much as well. Have a nice night.